right. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, for our next presentation with Dr. Judy St. Leger. Judy has also posted her bio, so I encourage you to check out her bio and a little bit of her background. She's going to share grazing sheep under solar arrays for us, and I will just let Judy take it away from there. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you a ton. I'm really glad to be able to speak here this afternoon, mostly because I'm currently lambing. So virtual attendance at meetings is a new thing 2 years ago. I found I could go to meetings in March. I just did them in between setting up lambs and ewes. That's all. So I'm also glad to be here because after listening to the last presentation, I was telling the organizers, A, I think I want to become a grass-fed dairy person. And B, I love that they talked about the solar on their barn roof and how there's lots of new and different ways that the sun that has powered agriculture for thousands of years can be used to help sort of be harnessed and power energy. What I'm going to talk about next is going one step further and taking those solar arrays that you see in the countryside as you drive around and making it so they're more than just energy producing sites, making it so that we're preserving agriculture. So the title of this talk is very well selected. I want to talk about preserving pastures and actually dual use of these solar sites with agriculture. So with that said, let's take a second and look at what's happening these days with solar. I don't think there's any surprises for anybody here. If you've driven around or looked around in the countryside, you'll see a lot of these solar array installations going up. These are two indicators. The top graph shows how solar is expanding. And I just want you to look at the different color bars. The lowest part of the bar is residential. So that's housetop, even barn top solar. The yellow band is non-residential. So that's what we call community solar. Those are those smaller solar sites. But if you look at the light blue or sort of turquoise blue, what we have is what we call utility scale solar. And you can see that that's growing significantly, especially from 2015, even 2017, 2019. These were estimates at the time, but I can tell you they're lower than reality. We're seeing a lot more utility scale solar going in, and I'll explain what that means when we talk about grazing on these solar sites. If you look at the map of the United States, I've included that here because you can easily see the dots are areas where these solar installations are going in. And there's a very strong focus on the East Coast of the United States, as well as the Southeast and then Texas. Now, this is the Northeast Grazing Consortium. So I want to talk to folks in the Northeast because we are seeing lots and lots of utility scale and even community scale solar arrays being put in this area. And I'd like to talk to you about how can we make these so that it's not just a whole bunch of panels taking up space on a field. Now, I've been a shepherd and a grass-fed farmer for the past 13 years, and we graze sheep. These are Texel cross market sheep from our farm, but they're not on our farm in this picture. They're actually about 15 miles away from our farm. And instead of grazing on my pastures at my farm, they're grazing on what I call the pastures under these solar arrays. And it's both under and between. Now, the sheep actually have a job when they're at these solar arrays, and it is to keep the vegetation down. So they have a different job than they have when they're on my farm, which is to eat the pasture and grow or raise lovely lambs so that we can produce the lamb for meat. The point is, where the sheep eat doesn't matter to the sheep, but it does matter to the farmer. And I'm hoping it might matter to you. So the first thing to think about is grazing sheep on solar arrays uses the same principles of rotational grazing. So we use what we call mob grazing. We use movable fencing. We rotate this fencing regularly. And by regularly, I mean 2 to 3 times a week, not once a day. You can do once a day if you need to or want to. But that amount of labor really does impact the farmer cost for implementation of these programs. We vary the grazing paddock size and the duration, how long the sheep stay in those paddocks, to maximize the effect. In other words, getting the vegetation down and minimize overgrazing. And I really want to bring home this point. Grazing on solar farms has the same requirements as grazing on your beloved fields. We do not want to overgraze or damage the fields with our grazing strategy, because that works against us as farmers. We see the same benefits on the solar fields as we would on our home farms. And if you look at this picture of my smiling sheep, what you see is there's great biodiversity here. We've got some nice black-eyed Susans in the front. We've got a variety of vegetative grasses and probably some forbs here just in the forefront of this one picture. The point of this is we can have tremendous biodiversity in our field vegetative components, and that really helps with soil quality, with erosion control, with ability actually of the soil to store carbon. So we get a lot of the pluses without too many minuses. Now, the whole world is not filled with pluses and no minuses. There are a lot of farmer benefits to solar, and I talk a lot to solar companies about why solar grazing is beneficial to them. But today I want to talk to farmers. First and foremost, I think everyone wishes they had more pasture. I know I sure do. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to get a little more pasture every single year. But additionally, we see added benefits that I never even thought about before we started grazing on solar. And it's things like added shade. If you look at this picture, these are tilting panels. So they are flat out in a horizontal orientation, but the sheep are all laying in the shade of the solar panel. They're doing so because it keeps them cooler and happier. Well, what's fabulous is it actually encourages the sheep to graze more, because they can graze in the shade as it moves with these tilting solar panels and increase the number of grazing hours in a day, because they have less challenge maintaining their thermal comfort. Now, I won't lie, one of the biggest added incentives for our farm in particular is the additional income we get from solar grazing. My sheep are going to be grazing regardless. And when I've got them grazing on solar farms, not only are they doing the job of growing lambs and growing meat, they're also keeping vegetation down, and our farm gets paid for that. And lastly, we're seeing sort of unexpected benefits. And that's things like increased flexibility with sheep. I'm a very big pro farmer and actually pro sheep kind of person. And this past year, we got a new breed of sheep on our farm, a heritage breed of sheep, a threatened breed of sheep, and a breed of sheep that's on our farm because they don't need to produce meat to be economically viable. In other words, all they have to do is be deployed on a solar field eating grass, and those sheep earn their keep as members of our farm. Now, it's part of diversifying our flock, and it's part of our farm ethos and farm plan to say we're going to have a threatened breed of sheep on our farm. We don't have to do that. We could make more money if we just stuck with our normal white-faced market Texel sheep breed. But because of the increased income per sheep, the flexibility we have to make decisions we wouldn't do otherwise is really increased. And I see that as very valuable. Now, good stuff always comes with bad stuff. And I put lots of the bad stuff on this slide here because I really wanted you to think solar grazing is not, it's not the holy grail. First and foremost, you have to be okay being a shepherd. So if you hate sheep, solar grazing is probably not for you. You need to have some skill with sheep because certainly you need to keep them healthy. And when we have them on pasture settings, these tend to be animals you're not going to see every single day. So you better do a darn good job with them every time you do see them. Animal selection is important. not only what kind of sheep do I have, but how many sheep do I have? So if I've got 3 grazing contracts for 2022, I expect to be putting animals on solar sites in the beginning of May. I'd better have the right number of animals that are appropriate to properly graze those sites available to me now, so that when it comes time to transport those animals, I've got them ready to go. Additionally, we've got to keep them somewhere in the winter. So I have sheep all over my farm, ask anyone who comes around, but I also have neighbors that I have cooperative agreements with, because I need more sheep that I can house on our home farm to meet the contracts I have for solar grazing. We definitely have increased labor issues with managing sheep on multiple sites. So if I had my main flock just on my home farm, it would be one farmer 2 to 3 times a week to reset the fences and move those sheep. But when I've got them on a variety of different farms, not only do we have travel time in between farms, but numerous fences have to be reset to move the animals for mob grazing. And that wouldn't be the case if they were all in one single flock here on the home farm. It's important for farmers to know about contract requirements and contract negotiations. We'll talk a little bit about how we can make that easier for you. There are increased capital costs because now you're moving sheep around and you may be handling hundreds of sheep on a site which is not your home farm. It's important to have the animal handling systems and the transport equipment to get the animals there and to deal with them when they're on site. Water is a very big issue when solar grazing. Although the ideal facility has water available for the animals, it is more often the case that water needs to be hauled in or at least locally sourced for the solar grazer and the sheep. Doing so is an added challenge that you don't normally have on your home farm, but it's one that must be addressed to be successful with solar grazing. You've got to have a grazing plan, same as ever. Professionalism is a little bit more important than normal. Let me explain what I mean by that. So this morning I had to go check my barn to see what I had for lambs being born. And I was tired. I hadn't had coffee yet. So I did not look my best when I stumbled out of my garage, walked the 20 feet across the driveway and into my barn to check the ewes and their lambs. It's a different story when you're driving up to a solar farm, stumbling out of your car and checking the animals with people observing you and your entire process on a solar farm. Your exposure is much higher. The animal health issues we deal with day to day. Imagine if an animal dies on my farm, I deal with that animal mortality and move on. If it dies on a solar farm, there may be people seeing that. There may be people who see it before I do. All of those considerations need to be wrapped around in the, how is this whole thing going to work for me? And then we talked a little bit about co-op arrangements. I don't normally have to arrange with my neighbors to have enough animals to graze on my property, but for solar grazing, I sure do. So there's pluses and minuses. And I put in more minuses than pluses because I wanted you to think, okay, this isn't, the simplest thing to do in the world. But when I talk to solar companies, one thing I do say is we have overall advantages of sheep for managing the vegetation. First and foremost, sheep are effective and safe. The alternative to using sheep is mowing and hand trimming, which is very fuel, time, and labor intensive. Sheep grazing is compatible with many different pollinator projects and many kinds of plantings. It preserves the agricultural use of these solar farms. It keeps solar farms farms. It has tremendous pasture benefits. Things like, as I talked earlier, increasing soil carbon, improving the diversity of soil microbes, helping with erosion and fresh water quality, maintaining grassland ecosystems. These are all super important to the environment and to the local sort of habitat, and sheep can be a big component of that. And here's the kicker, that when I'm talking to solar companies, gets them to sit up straight. Using sheep to maintain the vegetation on solar farms often reduces the maintenance expenses for solar companies. Now, my sheep are not going to eat their grass for free. They might, but remember, even if they ate the grass for free, I've got labor to take care of them off-site. I've got increased fuel consumption and travel costs to go back and forth to the site. I need probably to be hauling water, and all of those things cost money, not money that I am going to spend to have my sheep on the site. So yes, sheep can be a good advantage for solar producer for their operations and management of their site, but I'm not going to do it for free because there is a cost for me. And in truth, it's a great program when there's income for me as well. Now, we saw those solar panels on the barn earlier. It's really important to remember that solar farms, and this is not rooftop solar, this is actually having part of your land as a solar array, can really strengthen family farm income. So some folks have said, I'm going to take part of my land and use it to put a solar site on. I'm going to lease that out to a solar company. This is looking at different scenarios with solar and without solar in times of good grain prices and adverse grain prices. And this study actually said, hey, can solar provide a buffer to help commodity crop farms be more stable over time? And the answer is yes. Now, sadly, when you look at the two different solar versus non-solar, what we find is it's just that there's more overall income with solar than without solar. But that increase in overall income certainly does provide a significant buffer when times are tough with bad grain prices. And I did cheat. I looked ahead at some of the questions, and I'm going to answer one right now. It was, hey, you know, what's the financials per year? So when we talk about what do you charge for this solar grazing and how does it work? The normal in the Eastern US, contracting directly. So if I go direct to the solar company and I say, I'm going to have sheep that graze, I'm going to charge you $326 on average per acre. It's going to cost me on average about $64 per acre. And this study was done a couple of years ago. With current fuel prices, I bet that's double. I also graze some solar fields as a subcontractor. So there's actually a primary contractor and they subcontract to me. They deal with the insurance and liabilities, and I just provide the sheep and the labor to take care of my sheep. So my income per facility is less, but in truth, my net is not that much less, because while they include expenses to be the same as a subcontractor, my personal expenses are actually less. Now in New York State, those numbers are higher. So someone I think asked about Pennsylvania. I put this slide in particular. This was a Cornell study, as I said, a couple of years ago. But what we found is we're looking at anywhere between $300 and $600 per acre as the cost of working on these solar sites. And remember, a small site might be 10 to 20 acres, but a large site may be hundreds. So the words you need to know are first and foremost, these solar arrays, these solar farms are ground mounted. In other words, the solar panels are on the ground, and PV is what's short for photovoltaics. So if you leave here today, know that you learned that PV is not pre-varsity, it's photovoltaics. And we have community scale, and that tends to be 1 to 100 megawatts and direct generation of electricity. Okay, so those solar arrays tend to be much smaller. They tend to sell directly to the community, and they're what you see a lot of right now. But utility scale or grid scale photovoltaics are what's up and coming. And this is actually where I think farmers are going to make a difference as part of their livelihood if they are interested in grazing sheep. So I like this picture because see the farmhouse here? It's literally amid a sea of solar panels. Now you can see it and you say, ooh, that looks like a dairy barn. Imagine that as a sheep facility. Wouldn't it be easy to be the person who provides all of the grazing in that array with this facility. I bring this up because milk prices seem to go up and down in painful gyrations these days. And while we're in a good cycle in the milk price right now, a few years back when we were in a tough cycle, I was telling my neighbors, please get some sheep. As increased solar grazing opportunities come around, having sheep becomes more important. Now, we talked a little bit about learning a new language. There are a lot of things that are sort of different with solar grazing. Here in this big picture in the center, you see the sheep and you think, okay, I can relate to sheep, and the sheep are on forage or pasture. Okay, I can relate to that. But then you need to know some of the words that are important in the solar world, because when you're solar grazing, you're going to integrate with a group of people you wouldn't normally integrate with in your day-to-day world of agriculture. So things they talk about are the components of a solar array, the posts, the panels, the racking, which is really just the posts that are supporting the panels, the wires, the perimeter fence, the alleys. An alley is just the space between the different panels, the transformers, the inverters. The point is, there are lots of different words, but don't be afraid. It's like a new language. It takes time to learn a new language, but as long as you have the foundation of agriculture, that's what you need to start with. Now, let's talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of grazing on a solar farm. The foundational thing you need to remember is that not every site is a good one. So if someone calls you up and says, I'd like you to bid on a contract to graze a solar site for me, please don't jump in and say, okay, I'll do it for $300 an acre. I'll be there in 2 months, because not every site is a good one. One of the things that's fabulous about solar sites is that they have this terrific, mandated by regulation, exterior fencing. It's a chain link fence. And oftentimes it's lovely because it excludes predators, but not if it's like this picture on the right, where we have a 6-inch gap between the ground and the base of the fence. I couldn't let more wildlife in with that little gap if I wanted to. Well, maybe I could, I just make a hole in the fence. But the fact is, that kind of feature really changes the value of a solar site to a shepherd. And to me, it actually makes it somewhere I don't want to graze. Also, if the site is on a contaminated soil base, it is not uncommon for these sites to be put on what we call gray areas. So on top of landfills, on areas where there may be soil contamination. I work very hard to make sure my sheep graze on good vegetation that grows in good soil. And if the soil base is no good, I don't really want my animals there. And lastly, if the solar array is designed so that it's not neatly organized, if there are things like on this picture on the left where there are dangling wires, my sheep are not big troublemakers, but they're going to put their head through those hoops. They're going to nibble on those wires. And although I carry insurance, this is not something I want to work with. Let's focus on shooting for success. So let me show you what shooting for success looks like in the world of how can you help a farmer. What we have here is a solar site that's beautifully set up for solar grazing. This was actually one where a consultant, a solar grazing consultant, helped with the establishment of the solar farm. So in the lower right, you see the large exterior fence, which has not only good netting on the bottom, but then it's got high wires to keep anything from jumping in on the top. If you look in the upper right, it's also got interior fences that are hard built onto the site. This means that to go from paddock to paddock to paddock, all I have to do is use my trusty little border collie and have him drive the sheep from one paddock to the next. And to be honest, my sheep are so happy to go from paddock to paddock. I don't need the border collie. I just open the gate and they're very pleased to move from one paddock to the next. This site has interior gates so that when you are driving trucks around, you can block off part of the array. So you don't have to be working in the same place in the array as the sheep are. And on the left-hand side, we've got water provided for the sheep. I simply turn a nozzle and it fills up water trough with a float. So there's water available to the sheep all the time. This is not the norm. This is a beautiful, aspirational, make my heart sing solar array. This is not what I expect when I look at an array to bid in my area. Here's what I look for. I look for things like good perimeter fences, fences that go all the way to the ground, like the picture in the upper left. Below that is actually a fence that has wire on the ground so that nothing can dig under the fence. Well, that's just an added bonus, and I don't expect to see that most of the time. I like to see gates that are easily opened. This is a sliding gate, but a sliding or a swinging gate is fine, but we need to have good, easily available access to the interior of the array with trucks, trailers, and animal handling units. So because of it, we need wide gates, and we need them available so that idiots like me that can barely drive a truck can get the truck in, can get the trailer in, and get the sheep out. Now, if the fences are imperfect, there are some things you can do. Okay, so here on the left, this is putting in extra wires so that animals cannot dig under the fence to get to the sheep. In the center is sheep actually with a livestock guardian dog. Now, I'm not a pro livestock guardian dog on solar arrays person, and I'll tell you why not. Most of the livestock guardian dogs I know see it as their job to protect the sheep in all cases. And that means that if someone they don't know is around, they're going to be protecting the sheep. Remember that solar grazing involves putting your sheep on a site where there will be technicians who come and check panels, who do maintenance over time, who service the array. And if your guardian dog has problems with that, that is problematic. The guardian dog needs to have adequate food and regular attention. So you need to consider that when you say, how often am I coming to this array? So please consider, if you say, oh, I want to start solar grazing next week, if you need a livestock guardian dog, think about how that dog's role will change when you leave the home pasture for a solar farm. Lastly, the third picture there, it's not uncommon for fences not to have perfect fencing all the way to the edges. And so this is just a piece of hog paneling that's been put in to make it so that the fence is straight and strong all the way from the gate to where it needs to be for the shepherd. Now, that's all exterior fencing that we're looking at. Let's talk a little bit about this interior fencing. This is a site that I've been grazing for a number of years. And typically we do it by simply moving interior electronet. So we use electric fencing and we make paddocks. When the grass is not too tall, we will simply put the fence out and set it up. If the grass is tall, we have to mow a path so that the fence is not shorted out, because these fences are maintained via electric solar chargers. All of this is something to consider when it comes to labor and time. So in my perfect world, we put these up, we keep rotating so quickly that the vegetation near the fence areas does not get very high, and we do minimal trimming. In reality, probably once, if not twice a summer, I need to go in with clipping instrumentation and actually clip paths for these fences. So we've got them where there is not too much vegetation, and we keep them working to make the small paddocks that we use for mob grazing. Now, you don't have to use electronet. This is a facility up in Canada, and this is utility scale solar. So hundreds of acres of solar, and they maintain their paddocks for the sheep using 4 strands of electric wire that is actually semi-permanent. So these interior paddock fences stay there all the time. As I said, if you look on the bottom right, we have solar chargers that charge the electric fence. Some solar sites actually have plugins where you can plug into some of the generated electricity, but more typically, I tell shepherds, plan to bring your solar powered chargers onto the solar sites. One last thing to remember when we're talking about interior fences, this is a picture of a transformer and an interior equipment pad. And the reason these are fenced off is this site was designed with sheep in mind. Energy technicians need to get to these transformers, and it turns out they do not like walking through sheep poop. So rather than putting temporary fences around these pads, they just put a permanent fence there. And I recommend, if you're looking at a site, if they don't have permanent fencing around their transformers, if you're going to be grazing there, that you consider suggesting that as a way to make your life easier and their life easier. Now, water is a big consideration on solar farms. And it's a big consideration simply because interior wells, well, they're ideal, but they're not the norm. The norm is that clean water needs to be hauled and supplied in many sites. We tend to haul it for small sites in 5-gallon buckets. In large sites, we use one of those big square, I don't even know, 375-gallon, I think, liquid containers, and we simply fill out the water troughs. Interestingly, because the sheep have the shade of the solar panels, we find that they use far less of the water than they would otherwise, which is fabulous because it means we're not replacing as much water, but they still need to have fresh water no matter where they are. Now, other things to think about. Having a dog is almost critical to maintaining sheep on solar arrays. You need help moving these animals around, or you need a whole lot of labor. Certainly, having an animal handling system. Remember, these are off the farm animals. And if you've got lambs, you're going to need to handle them at least once a month. Even with ewes, you're going to need to see the individual animals occasionally. So having a handling system is important. And then on the bottom, don't forget, these animals are off site and we need to get them from here to there. So things like moving them in trailers is important. Let me explain what I mean by moving them in trailers. This past year, I had to move 100 sheep approximately 2 miles. I have a small 16-foot trailer that moves easily 20 to 25 sheep. That's 4 to 5 trips. And while you may think, oh, that's not a big deal, they're only going a couple miles, imagine the time consumed to load, unload, move, position, do everything with the trailer. It's a tremendous amount of time. So not only having trailers, but having trailers of the right size. And lastly, I really think you need to think about things like signage. We spend a lot of time communicating both with folks that run the solar arrays as well as with neighbors about the sheep, that the sheep are there on site. And if there are any problems, that we have phone numbers available so that people can call us basically at any time to deal with sheep issues. When the sheep are on site, we want to make sure that people know we are there to be part of the solution because we care about these animals and we know they're there to do a job. There are increased opportunities on these solar arrays outside the fence or in the perimeter. There are options for vegetation management. Some folks do it with sheep, but many do it with mowing. Some folks actually will do management both within the array and around the array by making hay. How handy is that? Getting paid to take down someone else's vegetation and produce hay for yourself and, taking home some cash as well. Many solar sites are designed as pollinator habitats. Here we've got some milkweed, I think, with a caterpillar. And certainly solar grazing does dovetail very nicely with pollinator habitat. I don't want you to leave thinking you've got to put sheep on solar farms. There are lots of different ways that agriculture can integrate with solar. So pastures for things like pasture reared chickens, even growing crops. There are lots of different ways to use the land under solar arrays with agriculture. And if you walk out of here today, I want you to take home one thing, and that is that land under those arrays is still farmland, and we need to see it that way, and we need to pursue it as farmland for all of us. Now, people say to me, I don't know where to start. What do I do? So I just want to spend 2 minutes and talk about the American Solar Grazing Association. This is the organization that I am executive director of right now. It was established 4 years ago to sort of meet the needs of solar grazers. We've developed tools like model contracts, vegetation seed mix. So we've got a great mix of things when solar companies are saying, what do I put down so the sheep have the right stuff to eat? We've got budgeting tools for farmers. We've got partial enterprise budgets, everything you need to say, how do I get started? Additionally, we've got a thing called the solar grazing map that helps to pair up. It's like Tinder for farmers and solar companies to help pair up folks who want to do grazing and folks who need grazers. And lastly, we've got tremendous research as well as outreach and monthly webinars to educate the solar industry as well as the agricultural industry in how well sheep and solar dovetail together. So it's important for you to think, hey, if this is something I even want to consider, I've got a resource to go to and a way to sort of deal with things. So with that said, we've got a few minutes left for questions. I didn't mean to take as long as I did, but I just wanted to do some of the nuts and bolts for you about, what is it like to graze on a solar farm? Does anyone have questions or thoughts that we should address? And if we're not going to be grass-fed dairy farmers, let's all be shepherds.
Thank you so much, Judy. There are so many questions. You've done a great job already heading a few of them off, but there are plenty of questions left, so do not worry. So I'll just start with the question that was just posted. Does grass productivity decline underneath the panels?
So
or is it reduced?
There's two different ways for the panels to be. They can be static or they can be dynamic. But what we're finding is that productivity, depending on the grasses that are seeded in the area, can be very similar. We do have a number of studies going on addressing questions just like that. And one of the things ASGA does is we're partnering with the New York State Energy research folks. We're partnering with the US Department of Energy and the USDA to say, okay, what do we know about these places and how do we make it best for solar companies and for sheep? Yeah.
Cool. Oh, that's great to know. It's always nice to know if we don't know the answer to something that someone is working on finding the answer. So that's terrific to hear. Okay, so a few different questions. We heard about, grazing solar arrays with sheep, but are there examples, or would you mind describing maybe some of the pros and cons of some other livestock choices, maybe cattle or
Sure.
goats?
Yep. So goats, no. Okay. So I'm a veterinarian and I love goats and I want everyone to love goats. And the fact that the goats are going to want to jump on things, get into mischief means let's just take goats off the table. Okay. But you said, what about cattle? And I think cattle are a great question. One of the things we know is that if we make the racking higher, in other words, the panels are higher up in the air, dairy or beef cattle would do fine under solar arrays. Now, obviously, there's increased costs for making the racking higher. So there's increased upfront costs to the solar company. But if there are government grants, other incentives, reason for a farmer to say, hey, I'd like to provide the shade for my animals and I don't want to have sheep. I want to have my cattle under those arrays. It's definitely doable. Now, the solar industry is very dynamic. And so as things change, a new development in the past year or two is instead of burying all the wires, some companies put their wires exposed. And that's a problem. It's even been a bit of a challenge for sheep because the animals run into the wires. So when I say today, oh my gosh, these arrays are great for cattle, that may not be the case with every array in 2 years, but right now it's very doable. Again, remember, it's not just grazing that pasture land. Folks are doing chickens, they're doing rabbits, they're doing vegetable propagation, blueberry propagation, cranberries. I want folks to see solar land as ag land. And if we make sure that's the case and sort of demand it from the solar companies, we will not be using farmland. will be improving farmland while it's generating energy.
Totally agree. And there's at least one project in Vermont where they're planting saffron underneath
Oh my
solar panels. So
gosh.
there's a little bit of everything happening.
Yeah.
So I did get some questions specifically around sheep.
Okay.
One of the questions was, you mentioned some threatened heritage sheep that you recently took on, and there was a question, what breed are those?
So we took on some, I call them my little black sheep. They are black Welsh mountain sheep, and you can learn about them from the American Livestock Breeds Conservancy. I'm very excited because we're going to use them for wool production. We have just a mixed, what we call a market meat breed, and then Texel sheep on this huge pro Texel sheep farmer. But we love the little black sheep, and I'm very excited to get them out onto solar farms this year.
Cool. Do you think that are there pros and cons to different sheep breeds, or some better adapted to doing this than others?
They sure are. Now, remember, it's just like shepherds. Everybody has their favorites, right? But
I'm a hair sheep producer, so I completely understand.
Things I recommend. So I'm not big on horn sheep on solar arrays. I think you're looking for trouble. I'm not big on very flighty sheep on solar arrays. I'm not big on rams anywhere near off your farm. Now, wethers. I used to say, why would anyone have wethers? Remember how solar means that sheep make money in different ways? Now it turns out that you could have a flock of wethers and their job could be just to eat grass, or maybe it's to eat grass, produce wool, and make mutton for sausage. In other words, we need to be rethinking how we look at our sheep enterprises, because we have a new potential foundation for the way for our sheep to make money.
Those are big questions too. So anyway, I love that. So we did have some questions about also the management of the sheep. So how do you catch sick animals in a large array, knowing that there's a large space that you have? And then also just the mechanics of moving them back and forth. Do you have to pre-train them to be good with trailers? Like how do you manage all of that sort of logistical stuff?
That's a great question. And I guess we'll make that be the last. And I will tell people, if you have additional questions, you can send them to me. Everybody's got my email, right?
Yes. Yep.
Shoot them to me in my email. I'd be happy to take additional questions. First and foremost, we bucket train our sheep because that really helps them doing everything. 2, we have a border collie, which really helps everything. And 3, I talked about animal handling systems. No matter where you are, on your home farm or on a solar array, you need to be able to work with your animals. And to do that, I prefer to have an animal handling system, which could be anything from just using the electronet to make small paddocks and then catching out 5 or 10 sheep and picking out the one we want, or running the whole flock down a chute till we get to the one sheep that we want to catch up and work with. In other words, it's the same management techniques as we would have if they were on the home farm in my 50-acre pasture, but it's complicated because there's a whole lot of solar array in between, sort of, for doing those kind of challenges. So it's not that hard, but it's as hard as it is at home.
Strategic use of the sidewalls, I would imagine.
Yes,
with that chain link fence. Yeah. Oh, and I think we actually caught most of the questions. I really appreciate you joining us, and thank you so much. Thank you for the referrals for ASGA as well. And we know that ASGA, I mean, you work all over the country. It's not just in the Northeast, right?
That's correct. That's correct. So the organization started in New York, and so we have kind of a New York focus. But ASGA has members actually around the globe now, and really does work and assists farmers and solar companies throughout the US to try to make solar grazing a real entity that's good for solar companies and good for farmers.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining us today. This
All
is
right.
fantastic. And we're gonna close it down. And our next presentation is in 15 minutes with Stefan von Vliet.
All right. Thanks,
So
everyone.
thank you so much.